Welcome. Yesterday was Thanksgiving, and I hope that it was a blessed, peaceful, and maybe even restful day for you, regardless of where you were or who you were with. Some of you may have been with family, and others may have Zoomed with your loved ones, which is what I did. You know, this is also a time to remember history and to honor the work and lives of Indigenous people, past and present. We don't often do that at Thanksgiving, and it's important. There are a lot of great resources about Indigenous sovereignty available online. And also, if you're unaware, you can find out the Indigenous territory that you live on by visiting native-land.ca and then typing in your address. Okay? I think that growing our knowledge, especially about Indigenous peoples, is such an important part of building a more just future. And this is a good time to do it. So today is still a holiday, and given what we've been going through in the last 10 months, for those of us who are able, we need to take full advantage of the holidays to kick back and rest. And that's what I'm going to do. And so is the rest of the Fire Drill Fridays and Greenpeace team. You know, it's been a really hard and very unusual, painful and stressful year. But we're going to get through this and come out the other side smarter, stronger, and more united for having navigated it. Don't you think? I do. Because it's a holiday, we decided to bring you the teach-in that we did at last year's Thanksgiving when I was still in DC. This was all pre-COVID-19, and so you see us together with no masks. It was also pre-election, so don't go wondering why there's no mention of COVID or the election or anything like that. We filmed it in the home of friends of mine because Greenpeace was closed, and our focus was on food and agriculture. You know, it being Thanksgiving and all, it seemed to make sense. And the issues that we raised in this teach-in are as relevant today as they were last year, maybe even more, as the climate is warming even faster, we now know, than scientists anticipated. It's important, I think, for us to understand the ways in which modern food production, sometimes called factory farming, has impacted the environment, accelerated the climate crisis, wiped out family farmers, and led to a nation where too many people are sick. But this can change. It really can. It must change, in fact, and President-elect Biden has pledged to address the problems with how food is growing and begin to return to regenerative agriculture. That will be more resistant to pests as well as extreme weather events and healthier for us all. My expert guests you're going to see are Wisconsin dairy farmer Jim Goodman and Ricardo Salvador, who is a senior scientist and director of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists, along with my daughter, Vanessa, a small farmer in Vermont. These guests will help you understand how we got to this untenable place when it comes to growing our food and what can be done to address it. Now, I also want to encourage you over this holiday to watch the Netflix documentary called Kiss the Ground, narrated by Woody Harrelson. I just watched it last night and it's really, really good. Just keep in mind that there is no one single magic bullet to solve the climate crisis. I mean, we need many different changes. The main one is to reduce fossil fuels. Another is moving to electrifying our transportation system. But as you will see, both in our Thanksgiving teach-in from last year and in Kiss the Ground, moving to regenerative agriculture is a critical part of it, okay? So sit back and enjoy and learn, and I certainly did. And remember that this was filmed last Thanksgiving, 2019. Enjoy. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone, and thanks for joining us. As you can see, we're not in our usual place for our teach-ins. We're in the home of Karen Nussbaum and Ira Arlick, who are friends and colleagues from 1972 when we worked together in the anti-war movement, anti-Vietnam War movement. And Ira provides communications, press relations for Fire Drill Fridays. And as is appropriate, given that today is Thanksgiving, we're going to be focusing on food and agriculture and how those are impacted by climate. My family has come down from Vermont to be with me today, and tomorrow my grandkids are going to engage in civil disobedience and risk getting arrested. So that will be 3 generations, yay! Like I said, we're focusing on food and agriculture, and we have several very fine experts here to educate us on this topic, starting with Jim Goodman. Hi, Jim.
Hello.
He and his wife, Rebecca, ran a 45-cow organic dairy and direct market beef farm in southwest Wisconsin for 40 years. His farming roots trace back to his great-grandparents' immigration from Ireland during the famine and the farm's original purchase in 1848. A farm activist, Jim credits more than 150 years of failed farm and social policy as his motivation to advocate for a farmer-controlled, consumer-oriented food system. Currently, he serves as a board member of Midwest Environmental Advocates and the Family Farm Defenders. Thanks for being here, Jim. Then we have Ricardo Salvador as the senior scientist and director of the Food and Environment Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Ricardo Salvador works with citizens, scientists, economists, and politicians to transform our current food system into one that grows healthy foods while employing sustainable and socially equitable practices. Thanks for being here, Ricardo.
My pleasure.
And finally, Vanessa Vadim has had over 20 years experience in rural and urban food production. She's currently small-scale farming in southern Vermont, concentrating on resilient agriculture and developing blueprints for post-carbon food production. As a syndicated columnist with the Mother Nature Network, she tackled issues of environment, sustainability, and health. She's an artist working largely, almost exclusively, with discarded materials, and an award-winning documentary filmmaker and cinematographer. She's also my daughter. Thanks for being here, Vanessa. So farmers are in crisis. Farm bankruptcies are up 24%. Trump's tariffs are a part of the problem, but farmers are among the most impacted by the climate crisis. We're seeing incredible crop losses due to more heat, more floods, more droughts, and more pest invasions. A huge problem is the way we grow food. It's responsible for 1/3 of all greenhouse gas emissions because of agribusiness-driven deforestation, energy-intensive factory farms, processed food packaging and processing, food waste, and transportation. The industrial food system is dependent on the very fossil fuels that are causing climate change, and many of the same companies are implicated. As renewables like solar and wind are taking off, energy companies are moving into industrial agriculture, investing ever more fossil fuel dependent fertilizer productions. Industrial meat is also a huge part of the problem because, number one, so much farmland is being diverted for animal feed and grazing because, two, factory farms are so energy intensive, and because, three, ruminants like cattle produce the heat-trapping greenhouse gas methane through digestion. 3/5 of agricultural land is used for cattle, even though cattle only produces 5% of the world's protein. And despite all of this, food and farming is a major part of the climate solution.
We can transform how we farm and provide vital regions and protect vital regions like rainforests from deforestation. We can reduce emissions and keep carbon on the ground and in the soils, not in the atmosphere. Organic and agroecology farming methods produce healthy, abundant food while building healthy soil and make for more resilient farms that are better able to withstand extreme weather. This is the good news. There are many ways to change how we grow, process, and transport food to be better for the climate, better for farm workers, better for the planet, and better for the health of all of us. So now let's turn to our guests to hear what each is doing to create sustainable and just food systems. Let's start with you, Jim. You have just sold your farm, in fact. Mm-hmm. Why is it that you have become so concerned about these issues and the way farming and agriculture contributes to the climate crisis?
Well, I think there's a lot of problems with small farms going out of business. You know, this get big, get out mantra that we've been hearing for so long is a real problem because, as you mentioned, as farms get bigger, more CAFOs, more monoculture of corn and soybeans, that's really hard on the environment. Small farms, and especially if you look at the developing world, small farms produce most of the food in the world. They're very low impact, very low input, and that's what feeds people. Farms run by women, by people of color. And in my 40 years of farming, and as a kid on the same farm, I grew up from seeing small farms, probably a dozen farms between our home and town that milk cows. Now there's one left.
Wow.
The farms are still there, but they're growing feed for farms that are now milking hundreds of cows or being sold to farms that are milking thousands of cows. And, you know, being a livestock farmer for all my life, sometimes I feel a bit guilty when I hear those statistics you cited because they're accurate and maybe they may be underestimated. Some people will say that agriculture contributes 30% of global greenhouse gases. But we can't paint livestock farming or any kind of farming with a broad brush. There are different ways of farming. There are good ways and there are ways that we've been trying since the Industrial Revolution, mostly since the 1980s, that do not work. They are too intensive. They produce food, supposedly, that is food for livestock, not food for people. And I think this idea that we somehow have a mandate to feed the world, I'm not sure who told us to do that, because I think the world is very capable of feeding themselves if we let them. And I think our idea is we can make them adapt our Western diet. And there's no way that we can feed the world a Western diet. I mean, we're going downhill fast enough. If we try and do that, if we try and make people eat more meat, more chicken, whatever it is, that it's not going to work. We have to go back to the regenerative agriculture systems that these small peasant farmers have been doing for generations. Hopefully, the seeds that they've saved, the knowledge they have, are things we can use, and we have to get off this industrial treadmill of GMOs, CAFO farms.
What do you mean by GMOs?
Genetically modified organisms, which supposedly, and I'm sure Ricardo can talk to this as well, it was supposed to start saving us back in the 90s. It didn't quite work, but the new generation is supposed to save us now because we can produce more with less. And all it does is produce more money for the corporations that develop it. Mm-hmm. Farmers have not benefited, people have not benefited, and the answer that they give us to feed the world is more high-tech agriculture that costs money, puts small farmers out of business, and increases the amount of climate change. So I think we are at a moment, and you mentioned 10 or 12 years, we have to turn things around pretty fast.
Yeah. Tell me, describe in more detail what you mean when you say intensive farming.
Well, the way that the genetically modified farming, the monoculture of corn and soybeans works is that that's what you grow. You rotate those two crops. Basically, the soil holds the roots. You provide everything else they need, the fertilizer, in many cases the water, because a lot of it's irrigated, and the pesticides. The kind of farming I did, organic farming, regenerative agriculture that peasants all over the world do, you don't have to have a lot of inputs. You manage your crops and your livestock so it's a holistic cycle that continues to feed itself, basically. True, you don't get the giant yields, but the value of the food, the quality, the nutritional value is much better. It's produced locally. It's culturally appropriate for people. The only thing it doesn't do, like I said, is make a lot of money for corporate agriculture.
with taxpayer subsidies.
Well, there's a certain amount of that too, yeah.
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 So what's happening to the small farmer like you were? Well, they're going bankrupt.
Well, yeah, and you know, I farmed through the 80s when we had the most recent farm crisis, and we saw a lot of people go out. Old farmers I talk to, like myself, now say, I think it's worse. You know, we lost more farmers in the 80s. There aren't as many to lose now, but the percentage is higher. And, you know, if you have to look at what you want rural America to look like. I mean, if you want a lot of big farms and a lot of manure spread all over, and people that don't want to live there because it smells too bad and there's, you know, pollution problems, that's the way we're going. I prefer to think of the kind of rural America I grew up with as a kid, where you had a lot of small towns with small businesses, machine dealers, car dealers, grocery stores, movie theaters. It used to work. You know, we used to have that. And that's gone now because the tax base is gone. The people are gone. There are no kids anymore. The school districts are closing down. So we've basically decided that rural America just doesn't need to exist anymore. And I don't agree with that.
Me neither. Ricardo,
Yeah.
tell us, why is climate change making this worse, and how is this contributing to climate change?
Well, what Jim has described is one style of performing agriculture, which, as he has told us, depends on purchased inputs. Purchased inputs. And so these are all the things that he said you needed to add in order to make cropland productive. And so for the typical farmer,
Fertilizers, herbicides.
seeds, the machinery, all of these sorts of things. This kind of system is productive on one axis, and that is that it can produce a lot. I can come back and tell you a little bit about why that's not a particularly magical feat, but it is measuring productivity and efficiency on one index. And the important thing to understand about that is that this system evolved when lots of other things were happening simultaneously on the planet. So, for instance, it evolved at the time when we began to get into the fossil fuel economy. It also evolved around the time that we began to develop today's economic theories. But prior to about the 1700s, what today we call the field of economics didn't exist. And the reason why that's relevant is that this is a field that studies how you make the best choices when the range of options in front of you is so complicated that it's not immediately obvious what you should do in order to get the best outcomes. And at that time, there were about 1 billion...
What time are you talking about?
About the 1700s.
Oh, way back, okay.
And that, coincidentally, is when this nation was colonized. And so, at that time, it did feel to about 1 billion people who were on the planet like the planet was an infinite source of resources. Mm-hmm. It also felt like the planet was an infinite sink for all of our wastes. And we developed our economic thinking with those assumptions. Now there are approaching 8 billion of us. The planet is finite in terms of the resources that it can provide. And it turns out that it is not an infinite sink for our wastes. And all of these things are creating problems. But economics doesn't value those sorts of things. So you can degrade the soil. You can extract resources from the ground that will never be replaced. You can pollute the water. You can pollute the air. But if you produce a lot in terms of wheat, cotton, rice, corn, soy, we say that we're being successful. So all of those things that are not being measured are an artifact of the fact that we're operating with very powerful technology of the 21st century, but we haven't updated our economic thinking, which is of the 18th century. Mm-hmm. So the way that climate change exacerbates all of this is that we don't currently have the tools, we haven't developed the knowledge base to be able to react and be nimble when climate change affects production. So things that farmers might do in order to capture carbon rather than release it out into the atmosphere would be to actually put as much carbon as possible into the soil. Deep roots, reincorporating organic matter as much as possible, making sure that we're closing nutrient cycles whereby livestock and crops are working together in order to be able to do that. The livestock eat the crop, they generate manure, which we then reincorporate. And there is an actual science as well as an art in terms of knowing how to do that. Right now, we've broken apart all of those systems and created linear systems where the nutrients are not regenerated, they're simply purchased from someplace else. The phosphate comes mostly from northwestern Africa, for instance. The potash in the United States may come from southern Canada, may come from Florida.
Potash?
Potash, it's potassium, it's one of the key nutrients that you need in order to produce a crop. So that means that when we run into problems because of the fact that these soils are now impoverished because there's very little organic matter in them, they will wash away quickly, they flood easily, you can't get machinery into them, you can't plant, that means that you're delayed. If you don't get to plant at all, then that means that you have no livelihood for that particular year unless you're in government programs. So it's essentially a disconnect that comes from pretending that we're running a factory that just happens to be outdoors, except that unlike a factory, we don't control most of what's happening outdoors. So we've not valued the knowledge that we need in order to be able to work with natural mechanisms. So another way of answering your question is that we have a model that Jim has described very, very well, which turns out to be very destructive, inimical to humanity's long-term interests, but we have alternatives. There are better ways of doing this, and we're not investing in those ways, and we're not telling farmers about them because, as Jim said 2 times, there is no profit in that. So the private sector, the corporate sector, is not motivated to get into that type of agriculture. So it doesn't have to be this way is the bottom line.
How much suffering because some people want the profits for themselves, my God. Now explain to me, because we think of carbon these days as being bad. You know, we don't want carbon to go up into the atmosphere. So why are you saying we want carbon to go into the soil and that's good?
Yeah. Okay, so a little bit of science here. There's this saying that the solution to pollution is dilution, and these days when we talk about carbon concentration being high in the atmosphere, this means that we're getting elevated levels of carbon that did not used to be there. But the carbon itself is part of a natural cycle. We're carbon-based organisms. The carbon cycles throughout the entire mantle of the planet, throughout the oceans. There are lots of different mechanisms that actually regenerate that. And the issue is that because of the way that we burn fossil fuels that used to be stored in the ground, we're releasing tremendous amounts of carbon into the atmosphere that did not used to be there.
I see.
So that's referred to as anthropogenic carbon. So that's actually the problem. And so agriculture can contribute in 2 ways to this issue. One is that, as you mentioned, this industrial mode of agriculture is very dependent on fossil fuels. It would be impossible to operate it at the scale and with the intensity that Jim described without the energy that comes from fossil fuels. Now, as I've said, there are alternatives. It isn't that that's the only model. So we could become less dependent on fossil fuels in order to produce. But another way that we could also help the matter is that we could take carbon that currently is being emitted and actually sop it up in organic matter in soil, in perennial vegetation, which could be agricultural and non-agricultural, because something that may shock a lot of people because the propaganda that one hears a lot in order to justify agribusiness selling as many of these inputs that we discussed about 5 minutes ago is that because there's poverty on the planet, we need to produce a lot more. And in fact, I would argue, and it doesn't take a whole lot of explanation, we actually need to be producing a lot less, and we need to produce the right stuff. And combining all of these things will give us a much better outcome that will be better for the planet in terms of the carbon cycle, in terms of our own well-being, because we're talking about a phenomenon here that humanity has never encountered with climate change, and therefore most of us are not prepared to even believe it. You know, there's a lot of denial because of the fact that if what the science tells us about what climate is going to do to us in the very short term, that means that our present lifestyle will no longer be viable. And that is too much for us to accept. It's much easier to deny that.
Thank you. Vanessa, do you plant your perennials to help capture carbon in the soil? Is that what has led you to focus so much on perennials on your farm?
Yeah, I mean, if you look worldwide, something like 85% of, well, 85% of our calories come from annual crops. And there are massive reasons why that really doesn't work. One, because most of those annuals are being monocropped. They don't have the root base, the complex root base that keeps the soil together. They have to have all of these inputs. Annuals also, compete with weeds, so you have all sorts of herbicides, and you have to constantly till, and so you have much more cover.
Soil cover,
but
ground cover?
Organic matter. You lose your topsoil, you lose your organic matter, you have to water more, you have to irrigate more, you have to have a lot more inputs. A perennial base, and we have perennial wheat, had been for ages, covering so much of our lands, even here in
Great
North
Plains.
America.
Mm-hmm.
Those have 12-foot deep roots. Compared to these annuals that are being constantly having to, sow the seeds every year, tilled every year, fed every year, watered because they can't get deep enough to get into to the water sources. But to answer your question, yes, I do. My growing is very much perennial oriented, but it's also systems oriented. So you'll have, for instance, a fruit tree is the main food crop of one kind of little unit. And around that, I'll grow comfrey, elderberry, strawberries, chamomile, so that you have a whole miniature ecosystem. Each one of the plants, some have very deep roots, so they're bringing up the nutrients that are needed. Some act as a living cover crop, so that you're not having to deal with weeds and competition. Each one has multiple uses, so that everything that's happening is not just a food crop, but also serves as an attractant for bees and other pollinators. So everybody has multiple jobs and works together. And like so many of these incredible ecological systems, what you end up with is kind of a multifold positive feedback loops, right? Instead of what we see so much in the climate crisis are these really negative loops where one thing feeds in and exacerbates the negative impacts of another, and we just start to snowball. Well, that works in a positive way as well. And that's really the good news with food and ag. And to me, even if I weren't a grower, I think that food and agriculture would be still my interest and obsession, especially in terms of the climate crisis. And that's because, yes, it's one of the main contributors to climate change. It's one of the main contributors, both because of methane, fertilizer, that's, nitrous oxide. So it's 300 times more powerful greenhouse gas than CO2. There's land use, all of it, right? We know, but it's also so much of the solutions are right there. We know people have been farming, forever. I mean, this is the base of human civilization, was agriculture. And we can do this. We can do this really well. And there are really, really elegant solutions. And a lot of that begins and ends in perennials.
Let me ask you a question about meat.
Okay.
Yeah. Should we stop eating red meat? Or is there a way to to ranch farm cattle that will not be so harmful, or is it just the amount of meat that we eat? How do we deal with this? Because a lot of people's lives depend on it.
This is a big question. And as someone who spent my life raising livestock, I think I'm qualified to answer it. I think, and I don't want to tell people whether they should eat meat or not. I mean, that's a choice they have to make. I would hope that they would make a good decision on it. I think you said, is it the way we raise meat? Is that the problem? And I'd say that's exactly right. It is the way we raise meat. We don't need to eat meat 3 times a day. We don't need to eat meat 3 times a week. I think everybody should eat less meat. Some people may not want to, and that's fine too. And we also need to take into account that in the rest of the world, small farms may have a pig or a cow, a few chickens, whatever, and that's a really, really important part of that small farm because it uses crop waste, it provides a protein source, it provides fertilizer for the soil, and it's very low impact. But the way we raise, especially beef cattle, in confined operations, and they eat nothing but corn and soybeans, somewhere in the middle of Kansas, Texas, Nebraska, and then are shipped wherever to be slaughtered. So there's a lot of transportation involved, there's a lot of monoculture crops involved, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emissions. It produces a kind of meat that's not good for people to eat because it's not grass-fed. So we need to stop that type of production and go back to a much smaller scale of livestock integrated in the farming system, be it ruminants or poultry or pork. But that's a decision people have to make, how much meat they want to eat, if they want to eat meat. But personally, I think we need to cut back a lot, an awful lot. But I think it can be a part of a sound farming operation.
Well, clearly, if we are recognizing the crisis that is upon us and the catastrophe that's looming, we do need to cut back.
We do.
We can't.
We do.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no two ways
Cutting
about
down so much of the Amazon rainforest to have cattle is insane.
it. It is. Yeah.
So it's a question of just less beef
yes.
and in a more integrated farm with other animals.
And the beef that we do raise should be done on pasture because you talked about perennial grasses. The Great Plains used to be covered with grasses and they're covered with buffalo.
Yeah.
It all worked fine. We need to try and mimic natural systems, and we need to do that in livestock and crops.
Yeah.
Whether it's fewer livestock on grass or perennial crops.
Yeah.
That's what we need to do.
When you take a train through Europe, you see cattle grazing on Vanessa's half French, grazing on grass.
Yeah.
And that's why their beef is so much better. Same in Argentina.
Well, and that's, as an organic dairy farmer, part of the requirement is that the cattle be pastured, but it only makes sense to pasture cattle. Cattle like to be on pasture. That's what they're supposed to do. And to my wife and I, that was one of the best things. We'd come home at night and we could look right out our dining room window and the cows are right outside the window eating grass because that's what they're supposed to do. And it only makes sense.
And now they just warehouse them with these pumps, right?
Well, yeah, it's very different. Some people do better jobs than others, but to me, when you try and run a dairy with 10 or 20 or 30,000 cows, that's not farming. That's like Ricardo's. That's a factory.
Describe what you mean by regenerative agriculture.
Okay, this is what we do when we manage, as Jim has said, patterning what happens in ecosystems. In other words, in the natural world. So. Probably one of the best examples that will make sense to people in North America, as well as in Patagonia, you mentioned Argentina, and across Central Europe, the places that today tend to be our major breadbaskets, is that nature built up very thick layers of very fertile soil in relatively short periods of time, tens of thousands of years. So geologically speaking, this is a relatively short period of time. And the way that happened by natural cycles was that vegetation would grow during warm parts of the year and then would die back during the cool parts of the year. That vegetation would be broken down by fungi and bacteria, would be reincorporated into the soil. And in the soil, that vegetation becomes what we call organic matter. The organic matter serves a lot of very important functions, but just at the physical level, you can think of it as being glue between fine particles of soil that otherwise would disperse. They would not clump together. And the fact that soil clumps together in particular ways that soil scientists call structure means that soil can do a magical thing. It can simultaneously do two things that appear to be the opposite of each other. Soil can first of all hold plant available water so that crops can take it up and transpire. And it's very important so that plants stand up, so that they keep themselves cool, so that they take up nutrients in that stream of water. But the other thing that soils can do is drain water so that plants are not standing in water, because roots need to breathe. And if they were flooded, which is the problem that occurs when soils flood, then they're not able to respire, they're not able to breathe, and so the plant doesn't function, dies off in a matter of just a few days. So the fact that soils can do that is due to organic matter, which actually functions as a glue. But more than that, it increases the fertility of the soil, because the properties at the chemical level are such that minerals that are constantly breaking down from the physical fraction of the soil are actually held, they're bound chemically to that organic matter. So the entire system regenerates itself when that cycle that I just described is acting in perpetuity. It builds itself. So in all of these areas that I've mentioned, since we've been farming in the industrial mode, which as Jim has mentioned is about 150 years, we've actually not only interrupted that cycle so that those fertile soils are no longer being created, we're actually degrading them. So that in many places, and the US Midwest is very good evidence, we've actually reduced the width of the soil by 50%. Wow. So what nature did over 10 to 14,000 years, we've undone in a period of about 150 years. And we mask that. Most people aren't aware of it and actually argue against the type of system that Jim and I are describing, because they say, all you need to do is to buy the fertilizer and nutrients. You don't need the soil to be doing that work for you. And so that discounts the value of what nature does, and then makes farming basically a transactional sort of industrial operation. And as I mentioned earlier, because of the fact that this kind of a system values productivity measured by capital investment and return on that investment, then that appears to be efficient. But because it's not measuring the degradation of the soil, the loss of intrinsic
The
fertility,
health of the people.
the loss of biodiversity, and then, as you say, what economists would call externalities, which is that what we're producing is essentially stuff that goes into processed food that then makes us sick. It pollutes the environment, pollutes the water, generates greenhouse gases. And so for all of these reasons, I mentioned earlier that it doesn't have to be this way. We have better models that not only have been practiced in the past, but which nature actually models for us. That's what regenerative agriculture is about.
Thank you. What a great answer. I want to see. Well, let's take questions from the audience and see if I have time for one more.
We have a question from Penny from Pennsylvania. Penny asked, what activists or movements are you thankful for today?
Fire Drill Fridays.
Well, I'll throw a few out there just very quickly. The National Family Farm Coalition addresses an issue that Jim mentioned, which is that in the model of agriculture that we're describing right now, people are not only expendable, they're actually not necessary. You will actually talk to very serious folks in agriculture that are already envisioning an agriculture that you could literally run from a computer screen sitting in Chicago, with machines that basically are autonomous, that derive all their information from satellites that are out in space, based on maps of fertility and yield that have been collected over years, and that run models to predict when there might be a disease outbreak in a particular place, or where you need to provide more fertilizer to get the most return, and so on. And you see people nowhere there. I want to say something very important about that. I'll just say that it's my personal opinion, but I think that the evidence is out there to support this. That model of agriculture that does not value people has actually created a social disaster in this country that explains why the very viability of our democracy is in peril at this moment. Because that wave of rural people primarily can tell that they are not valued by the rest of the country, that they're seen as throwaways. We're not investing in their economies. We're not investing in their livelihood. We don't value the knowledge that they have. The National Family Farm Coalition works against all of that. So that's one group of activists that I strongly support. There is a group based in the Hudson Valley of New York that I want to bring to everybody's attention. It's called Soulfire Farm. This is...
I was just there.
Oh, were you? Okay. So, well, I'll let you tell the story of Soulfire Farm then. And then one other group that I'll mention is the HEAL Food Alliance. HEAL stands for Health, Environment, Agriculture, Labor. It is a coalition of about 60 grassroots groups that are essentially the groups that represent the interest of everybody along the food chain. The people that do the planting, the people that do the harvesting, the processing, the packing, that deliver, serve stuff to us, work in grocery stores or the back of the house operation, that typically are not taken into account or valued when we do the accounting of agricultural productivity. So I highly recommend those three groups.
And then Farm Aid, Willie Nelson's organization.
Farm
That's your
Aid.
part of it.
Yeah, Farm Aid started in the 80s farm crisis, and they thought, we'll do this thing and everything will be fine, and here we are, all these years later, still doing it. I guess the group I'm really thankful for, and it's not specifically a group, but the movement is the Green New Deal, because I think that takes into account all the activist groups, because we need the Black Lives Matter, we need the Me Too movement, we need activist groups for farming. So this has to be a societal movement, and that's what we're here for.
It speaks to exactly what you just said. We can't solve the climate crisis if we don't have fairness and justice at the core, to put people back in the center.
Right.
And that's what the Green New Deal calls for.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot to be grateful for. Next question.
So Sarah from Massachusetts is asking, how does the Green New Deal address food justice in agriculture?
Well, the Green New Deal is a coalition or a group of so many people that I don't think the AOC and Bernie Sanders, whoever came up with it initially, Markey, could spell it all out. So they need people to do that. But it addresses, and I think pretty much the way we're talking about it here today, that just as we need to get rid of fossil fuels and change that dynamic of the economy, we also need to change the agricultural economy. We need to bring more people back to the land, more women, more youth, more immigrants, more migrants. We need to produce food locally. We need urban gardening. We need to get rid of subsidies. So it pretty much addresses everything in one form or another. And again, as I said a minute ago, we need a societal change. We can't just pick one thing out and say, well, we'll change this. It has to be everything, because we've got 10 years left, right?
Yeah.
It's when you think about the Dust Bowl, right? I mean, we've been here before. We know better, and it was our backward farming practices that led to the Dust Bowl. That was a massive environmental disaster that people, I think, tend to forget about, and was largely part of the base of the New Deal. It was our failed agricultural and ecological practices that brought about the first New Deal. So now we have an opportunity to have a New Deal now
That speaks to everybody.
before we get to that total catastrophe.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that really passed the New Deal was, it just so happened when they were in Washington debating it, a huge dust storm blew in right over Washington, and it passed. Now, I hope we don't have to wait for a transformational moment that convinces everybody in Congress that it's really time to do something, because we can't wait that long.
I think one of the important aspects of the Green New Deal was that, Roosevelt was a good guy, I guess, but it was people in the streets in the millions who were demanding that he solve these problems. Mm-hmm. And he said, I agree with you, now go out and make me do it. And that's what we have to do in bigger and bigger numbers. We have to make our elected officials do what's needed. Do you have any questions from other parts of the world?
Yes, there's actually a question from Uruguay. Jose from Uruguay says, how is food being affected by extreme weather?
¿Qué tal, José, en Uruguay? Saludos. There's several different ways because of the way that agriculture is a complicated set of parts that are working together. So, it's a complicated system. But the key thing is that if we're talking about industrial systems, these are very brittle, meaning that they're very vulnerable to what climate change is doing. Climate change to farmers looks like temperature extremes that they hadn't seen before. Planting seasons that are coming later. Too much water at the wrong time, and in some cases, insufficient water. So all of that means
Pests.
that there is less production. So this is a very important point. If you didn't hear that, Jane just said pests.
Pests.
One of the key things about industrial systems is that for all that they appear to be very productive, and this is probably about the third time we're talking about appearances that are not actually true, they're actually biological deserts, where the definition of desert has to do with lack of life and lack of diversity, lack of biodiversity. So if you actually wanted to create a nursery for a very specific population of insects, or it could be of fungi, to propagate, given appropriate conditions for them, you would create what today we call monoculture crops. So millions of acres of extension of just one thing. And so in temperate parts of the world, those pests have traditionally been controlled by extreme cold during the winter seasons. These days, because of the fact that we don't have extreme cold that is of a degree sufficient to actually kill off insects in the winter, then the populations actually now are propagating to greater and greater numbers year on year. So what that does in the industrial system is ratchet up the need for yet more inputs, either through the utilization of insect-resistant crops, or through the use of more insecticides, more pesticides. And insecticides in particular tend to be the more noxious of the chemicals that we use in agriculture. Just generalizing very broadly, insects share more of their biochemical pathways with human beings than we would share with weeds. So even though there are some very noxious herbicides out there, we really need to worry about the toxicity of pesticides that we use in agriculture. So it's not a good thing. No one will tell you that it's a good thing that when we need to use more of those. So going back to Jose's question, climate change is making it more difficult to produce. It is making it more expensive to produce. It is making it riskier. And so that means that all of the systems that are investing in providing insurance to farmers, the actuarial analysis has to change dramatically, and the cost to the public is increasing. So in countries like the United States and in the European Union, where we have specific sets of crops, where we agree that we make the farmers whole, whether the market goes south on them or whether they encounter climate disasters, we are having to pay more now because of climate effects. So there's a range of ways in which the climate is affecting our food production.
And we know that if we move to a Green New Deal and we did what we should do, the climate extremes are going to get worse because of all the heat that's been baked in because we didn't act earlier.
Right, yeah.
And regenerative agriculture makes farms resilient, right? They will be able
By
to
design.
withstand extreme weather
By design,
events.
because you're not depending on any one
Right,
thing.
yeah.
One last thing about the way that climate is affecting crops. There's a growing body of evidence that the nutritional value of crops is diminishing
That's
under climate change. Now, we're still trying to understand exactly what that is, but one model that is very likely to explain it, or at least is going to be involved, is that with higher temperatures you get faster crop growth, and it gives crops less time to actually absorb crops or nutrients. And that's called a dilution effect. You get much more vegetative matter over a short period of time, so less time to actually take up nutrients. There's other reasons, but I just wanted to mention that that's
Yeah,
another
and the
factor.
higher CO2 levels will tend to mean more carbohydrates produced within the plant, but less nutrition, less minerals, less vitamins,
Protein.
less proteins.
Wow.
The protein levels drop, the nutritional levels drop.
Well. Another question?
Yes, we have a question from Aman, who lives in Virginia. There's been a massive decline in pollinators like bees. How will this impact our future food systems, and what can we do?
You know, Albert Einstein in 1950 said, you know, we lose the bees, we lose our food. And, you know, we've known for a long time that we were in trouble, not just with the climate, but with bees. And, you know, they aren't the only pollinators, but they are, it's, you know, it's like corals in the oceans. You know, you lose such a main force within a complex system, the whole system begins to collapse.
It's the same with bats. Nighttime pollinators. Bats are very, very important to pollinating, and they're also endangered.
Exactly.
Yeah,
All our tropical fruits pollinated by bats.
correct. Another question?
Yes, Michael from New Jersey asks that I've read that climate change has a real health impact for agricultural workers. What can we do to be supportive, like when we boycotted grapes with the United Farm Workers in the 70s?
So we're working on a report on this right now. So folks that are interested in this, on December the 5th, you can come to the website of the Union of Concerned Scientists.
Say that again more clearly.
Sure. December the 5th, at the website of the Union of Concerned Scientists, you'll be able to find a report in English and in Spanish that details the ways that increasing heat are an increasing peril to people that are working in the fields. That in spite of the fact that most of us believe that we have a very modern, blinking light, shiny agricultural system, are the essential part to make agriculture work, all the way from meat packing, dairying, vegetable and fruit production. They depend on a labor force that does menial work. And this is outdoor work, and this means that they're exposed to the elements and that they're exposed to the most toxic chemicals that we produce, as we mentioned earlier. What compounds all of this, you know, one might say, well, that's inherent to the job. What compounds all of this is that for reasons having to do with the fact that under slavery, this used to be work that to plantation owners was free. When we replaced that after emancipation, we didn't accept that then we would pay the fair price of what enslaved people were doing. So that means to avoid the true costs of labor, we actually make exemptions to fair labor protection standards for agricultural workers. It's specifically for agricultural workers, so we know exactly what we're doing, we know exactly whom we're doing it to. And because of the fact that the majority of these folks are people that are essentially economic refugees, they're under duress, this is what they can do in order to support their families, this is a heinous type of exploitation because we don't give them the legal protections that any of the rest of us would expect that we would have in order to be able to ask for better treatment. All the way from just not giving them the legal standing, but also not giving them access to citizenship. So this is a population that is really vulnerable not only to labor exploitation. As heat increases, I'll give you just one example that you'll read about in these reports that I'm telling you about, because these folks are trying to protect themselves not only from the harsh conditions in the field, but from the pesticides, the herbicides that they're exposed to. They tend to dress in layers, wear masks, wear caps, even under high heat conditions. So that means that as the temperature increases, then their exposure to heat stroke is only going to get worse. So for more details, look at this report on December the 5th at our website.
Now,
And part of the question was, what can a person do? Vote, 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 vote. Pay attention to the Farm Bill, the Green New Deal. And, you know, we're seeing farm workers in particular, and people who are outside, kidney failures because of heat exposure. And as a consumer, you know, don't buy food from companies and corporations that don't have good labor practices.
If there's a if there's a farmer's market near you, buy the food.
Go to your farmer's market.
to
Get to
table.
know your farmers. Do as much food to table as
And
you
for
can.
people who are watching who live in cities and might not have farmers markets, what very specifically can they do to help with this issue of food and agriculture?
Well, I really think that urban gardening, urban farming is something that has to be part of the Green New Deal, because so many cities have vacant land, and granted we're going to have to do some mitigation on some of the problems with it, but take Detroit, I mean, thousands and thousands of acres. That could be farmland, and it's right where people live.
Right.
We ship food so far, and a lot of people think all our vegetables come from somewhere in the United States. Most of our winter stuff comes from Mexico, Peru, who knows where, and Chile, they fly it in, and airplanes, they fly food in airplanes. We can build greenhouses and use geothermal to heat them. There's so many solutions that we have to make, but no one has been doing the research on it because, as Ricardo and we've all said, the system we have pays so well. So we need to redivert the research into these solutions that farmers know work, and on a small scale they're doing them. We have to scale that all up.
Mm-hmm. Ricardo, do you have anything to add to that? What people can do?
So all of this, but then the other thing that people can do, Vanessa, you mentioned voting. The reason why that is important is that the system that we have in place is affirmed by a set of very complex policies that amount to basically self-dealing on the part of agribusiness. They write the rules that benefit them, not what benefits the majority of the population. Why should regular citizens be asking what in the world they can do so that they can have a healthy, fair food system that they don't need to worry about, think about, feel guilty about? The default should be that that's the way that the entire food system should work. And so the government, which is there in the public interest, in theory, should actually put laws into place. We should have policies that actually make it so that these are the practices that everybody holds to if they expect to have government support for what they do. And we have completely the inverse of that right now. And specifically, it's a very small proportion of people. If you talk to agribusiness folks, they say that their market is about 60 to 70,000 farmers that generate the majority of the agricultural output of the United States. The nation's agricultural policy should not be to benefit 60 to 70,000 people. If they believe in markets, they're free to do whatever they can, but the government should actually support the entire population, not just that small set of players.
So besides getting a new administration next November, what things can be done on a state and local level? Well, obviously local farms like Vanessa's, and legislatures can...
Yes, absolutely. So let me give you an example. We are working with some legislators at the federal level right now to get policies in place for soil health, to support farmers to do the sorts of things that we've been talking about here. But for the reasons that everyone is aware of, moving these kinds of things at the federal level is going to be difficult. It is fairly typical in American politics that states often can be more nimble and move more quickly than the federal government can. And we did an initial scan to see what ideas there might be out there, and we discovered that there were a little bit over 200 different soil health initiatives already moving in the states. So some of these are in the places that you would predict, Northeast, out in California, but there's a surprising number of them that are in place in the Midwest. So Nebraska has a very strong initiative that they're working on. New Mexico just passed a soil health bill. So yes, people in the states can actually demand this not only of their federal representatives, they can demand it of their state legislatures as well.
And can they go online and find out what measures are pending in their states?
So we will have that information available very soon at our website as well, because what I've told you about is the result of a publication that we're going to be putting out. So if you go to the Union of Concerned Scientists website, basically just search for soil health, you'll find that information.
Union of Concerned Scientists, Soil Health.
We've got a couple more questions and we have time.
All right.
Okay.
So Jack from New York asked if genetically engineered food is part of our path forward.
No. You know, I mean,
Next
again,
question.
I hate to paint anything with a broad brush, but, you know, the promises that they made for genetically engineered food back in the 80s and 90s was less pesticides, drought-tolerant crops, healthier crops. None of that came true. The next generation is out now with gene editing, where they map the genome, and honest to God, they're using the same arguments. They're saying the exact same thing as they did 30 years ago. And if they would have been honest about it, if they would have said, we really like this genetic engineering because it's going to make a lot of profit for us, I would have said, fine, that's the truth, I believe it. But they made all these claims that it was going to help everybody else, and there was nothing there for anyone. Farmers bought into it initially, it didn't pay out. They used more pesticides, not less. So I'm just going to say, I really don't think so. I just really
Okay,
don't
I
think
want
so.
to play devil's advocate. I think that if the United States stopped being the breadbasket of the world, stopped furnishing a lot of food for other parts of the world, a lot of people would starve, Ricardo.
Yeah, the problem with that argument is the assumption that we're actually selling food to hungry people. So we produce a lot of commodities, and these are purchased by countries and economies and actually other businesses around the world that do with their commodities exactly the same things that we do with our commodities. So they're producing biofuels with it, they're thickening soups, they're fattening livestock, they're sweetening soft drinks. Those are the people, and that's the food system that what we're producing is actually contributing to. Something that very few people are aware of is that when it comes to actual food, so for instance fruits, vegetables, things of that sort, they're good for our health. We actually import more of that than we export, particularly in organic fruits and vegetables. So it's the Caribbean, it's India, it's portions of Latin America. They're actually feeding the United States while we're making the world sick with the sort of stuff that we're producing. So that's the major problem with that argument.
That's a good, very clear answer.
And you know, when we're talking about climate crisis overwhelmingly, and you know, we're at a point, the system just has to change. It has to. And you know, especially when it comes to GMOs, I think one of the things, if you kind of pull a lot of what we've all said, is that really when you're talking about food and agriculture, we're talking about soil. It's always over and over and over about soil. You know, I don't grow food so much as I grow soil. I mean, that's what we do as growers and as farmers. And we just can't afford to be transporting and shipping out and importing food the way we have been. It just doesn't work. It can't. The good news is that means good jobs, you know, with worker protections in place, the kind of biodynamic, resilient farming that we're talking about is a really good job. Those can be, I mean, hot out, you know, unfortunately that's going to pretty much unavoidable at this point, but with less chemical and toxic inputs, we have localized, much more secure food systems as well. I mean, that's really, you know, the other piece of it is food security. And so, you know, a GMO, it's just another plant. It doesn't deal with the system.
The system
And
changes, yeah.
when you're talking about feeding the rest of the world, it's just not an option anymore. We have to, and as I think you were saying earlier, people have been feeding themselves very effectively for many, many years. This is, you know, much more our problem than the rest of the world. And localized, you know, biointensive kinds of farms that are diversified are better for the farm workers. They're better nutritionally for the end, you know, for the user, for people actually, and it's better for the planet. It captures more CO2, and you know, it's win-win-win all around.
So I hope that you feel that you've learned a lot. I certainly feel I have. I hope you've had a wonderful Thanksgiving. Please be sure to follow Fire Drill Friday on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook for updates and information on our upcoming teach-in and rallies. And also be sure to visit www.firedrillfridays.com greenpeace.com, and tune in tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern Time to watch our live stream of the rally, or come join us if you're in DC. You can also text Jane to 877-877 to sign up and get involved. Thanks a lot. And if you're in DC, come tomorrow. I'd love to see you there. And next week, we're going to focus on climate, migration, and human rights. Happy Thanksgiving. Thanks.